You guys wanted more tightly matched tests on the topic of the Sony a7 III versus the Nikon Z6? Well, today you're going to get them. Let's get undone. Gerald Undone. He's crazy. What is happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and today is going to be my final video in the Nikon Z6 trilogy. And it's going to be a rather simple one. We're going to be testing two things, autofocus and image quality. And these tests are going to be done in photo modes as well, so won't be restricted to just video shooters. In my previous video, my summary was basically that the Nikon Z6 was great and extremely close to the Sony, but that I preferred the Sony just a little bit more. I also mentioned that I preferred it a little bit more for photography, and a few of you Nikon shooters seem to be a bit bothered by that. So today I'm going to hopefully show you why I prefer the Sony for photography by demonstrating two factors that are important to me when it comes to choosing cameras, which are continuous autofocus speed and reliability, and overall image sharpness. What's important to remember here though is that these are the factors that are important to me and why I favor the Sony, but for you the factors might be different. There were some comments in the previous video though that I think did well to hit on some other factors that might make a person favor the Nikon, so in the interest of fairness, I'm going to read some of those to you now. DIY Hack said that they appreciate the improved EVF and LCD on the Nikon and the better touch functionality, and those are good points. The EVF and LCD are both noticeably better on the Nikon, and I think the touch functionality is quite good as well. DJ CJ Video echoed the same sentiments about the EVF and LCD, but they also preferred the larger buttons on the Nikon and the superior weather sealing. Again, both good points. I think ergonomics is going to play a big factor here since the hardware is so close. Essentially, choose whichever camera you enjoy shooting with more, because that will always make it a better purchase. And the last point I want to mention here that quite a few of you hit on was lens pricing. Now, it's definitely true that Sony lenses cost more in the long run than Nikon ones, so that's definitely something you should factor in when you're doing your overall value equation. Today, however, we're not going to be using Sony lenses, we're going to be using Sigma art lenses because it was the only way that I could get the same lens on the Sony and the Nikon. For the Nikon, I've also got the new 35mm f1.8s, which we'll use to cross-reference to try and eliminate any concerns that might be raised by the FTZ adapter when using the Sigma to say, is it caused because of the adapter or does the same thing happen on the Nikon native lens? So we're going to be using that one as well. But as someone who's used Sigma art lenses extensively, both natively and adapted, I believe that the lens is performing normally on the Nikon through the FTZ adapter, so that would suggest that the adapter is doing a pretty good job. I also want to thank Camera Canada for supplying me with these lenses and adapters on such short notice so that I could make this follow-up. As I've mentioned before, Camera Canada is definitely my favorite place to shop for all things Sony or Nikon, so if you're interested in any of the gear that we talk about in this video, make sure you check out their links in the description below. Alright, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to put both cameras in AFS mode, and I'm going to use the Sigma 35mm art on both with the same aperture, and basically I'm just going to use a small focus area located somewhere near the center, and I'm just going to hold the AF on button until it turns green, moving back and forth between two targets about 10 times. Then we're going to do the same thing with AFC, and then the same thing with video. And at the end of the focus tests, I'm going to attempt to take the exact same photo with all three lenses and compare sharpness. In the last video, some of you mentioned that you thought the softness on the Nikon when shooting the Rubik's Cube was caused by it being out of focus. I'm going to use a measured distance to make sure the cameras are at the same location. I'm going to obviously set all the framing elements up the same. I'm going to use a mat with a grid layout so that I can keep everything in exactly the same location. I'm obviously going to be using the same aperture, and I'm also going to be using the Ninja 5 as a monitor to ensure focus in multiple ways. Whenever I do tests like this, my goal is always to compare things as closely as reasonably possible, but keep in mind that when you're in the field, you likely won't have time to be this precise, so slight variations in the testing that may show differences in performance is still valid data, because those same variations are likely to occur when you're in the field using the camera. But anyway, let's get started with the AFS tests. So my thoughts on the AFS when it comes to the Nikon is that it handled it extremely well. I can't see anybody having any issues when it comes to speed or reliability with AFS, whether they're using native or non-native lenses. The Sony, however, definitely struggled, and this has always been an interesting thing about the Sony because Sony's AFS is definitely weaker compared to their AFC and also weaker compared to other cameras' AFS systems. If you want to know more about why this is, check out my video on the different autofocus systems, but essentially it's just kind of a known thing that you're better off leaving your Sony on AFC versus AFS for most purposes. The issue with many lenses on the Sony is that the focus seems to step back a bit before going forward when using AFS, similar to what you'd expect to see with a contrast detection-based system. For most native Sony lenses, all this really means is just a tiny delay before pushing forward and acquiring focus, but this little delay seems to really trip up the Sigma 35mm art for some reason. I believe that many of the negative reviews online that complain about the autofocus on the Sigma 35 for Sony E are actually just experiencing this anomaly. My thinking is that because the Sigma tends to move the glass so quickly, that when it jumps back a little bit first, it might actually reach all the way to the close focus and then just kind of stop and give up and not know what to do next. And so you actually have to press the autofocus button again in order to make it go forward. And that's part of the reason of why the autofocus seems slower in the video here where I was demonstrating with the Sony, is because I actually have to double tap the AF on button sometimes in order to get the Sigma to then go ahead with the second stage of focusing after the moving back, because it just kind of goes back and stops. Now this is a definite con for Sony that happens on many lenses, but it is significantly worse on the Sigma 35mm, and maybe it can be fixed in an update down the road, but for now, the Nikon wins this round easily. Now let's do the AFC tests. For these ones, I'm just going to be holding the AF on button down the entire time, and switching back and forth once it seems like it's grabbed focus. So for AFC, both lenses performed quite similarly on the Nikon. I actually have trouble telling them apart for this test, and I would say both did really well and are perfectly acceptable. In fact, I'd even say that they showed great performance, but they're still noticeably slower than the Sony, and you'll also notice that the Sony no longer has that stop-start problem. So my advice to any new shooters of the A7 III is just to put your camera on AFC mode and leave it there. It'll outperform the AFS mode by a large margin and give you much better results. Another thing that I prefer about the Sony when it comes to AFC over the Nikon is that you still get focus confirmation with that green light. The reticle still lights up green even when you're doing tracking in continuous mode to let you know that you're in focus. With the Nikon, the box just stays red and you kind of have to trust it, and I don't really like that as much. But I suppose it's a good thing that the Sony has this for AFC because, like I said, I wouldn't typically use the AFS mode, and the Nikon has the green light in their AFS mode. Anyway, Sony wins this round, and this is one of the reasons why in the previous video I was saying that I preferred this Sony over the Nikon Z6 when it comes to photography. I think maybe a few of you got confused thinking that I was saying that about Nikon in general. I think the Nikon has some DSLRs of the D850 that perform incredibly well for autofocus, but when comparing the A7 III to the Nikon Z6, the A7 III definitely outperforms it in autofocus continuous, and that's an important factor for me. Now, while I had it on AFC, I also did some continuous burst shooting to check and see what the keeper rate would be like to test the reliability factor of the focusing of these cameras as well. For the test, I would do one run pushing in and then another one pulling out while holding the AF on the entire time. And this is a rather difficult test for cameras because a lot of cameras struggle when you do a rapid pullback with keeping up with the focus. So here are the results. First up, we have the Nikon using the Sigma lens, getting ever closer to the Rubik's Cube. For scoring, if the image was usable, it gets a 1, and if it wasn't usable, it gets a 0. But I've also allowed for a 0.5, which would be for cases where the image was, somewhat usable or almost usable. It did an okay job, but not perfect. And now here's the pullback results for the Nikon and Sigma combo. And now the push-in results for the Nikon using the Nikon lens. And then the pullback for the Nikon on Nikon. And now let's look at the Sony, pushing in towards the Rubik's Cube. And pulling back. Here again, I would say the two Nikon lenses perform similarly, even though one of them is adapted, which speaks well of the adapter, but I will say that the native Nikon lens seems to have handled the pullback a little bit better though. But the clear winner here is the Sony. It doesn't struggle for as many frames during the pullback, and it had more total keepers than the Nikon lenses. I actually performed this test several times. I'm not going to bore you with hundreds of collages, but the Sony did consistently outperform the Nikon. And this is another big deal for me when it comes to photography, the reliability factor. And if you pair the Sony with some of their more impressive autofocus lenses like the 400mm f2.8 or the 24mm G Master, you will be amazed at the keeper rate. I still have yet to miss a shot with either of those lenses. It is shockingly good. And now finally we have the video autofocusing tests. Something interesting about the Nikon in the video autofocusing tests is that the Nikon lens and the Sigma lens focus differently. The Sigma goes for instant focus regardless of the speed setting in the menu. It doesn't matter whether you set it to -5 or +5 for the speed setting, the Sigma just automatically jumps to focus regardless of where you set it. The Nikon 35mm lens, however, is sensitive to the speed setting in the menu, but no matter how fast you set it, it's never as fast as the Sigma lens. I would suggest that the Nikon lens might be better for video if you want to get smoother pulls, but the Sigma lens is definitely faster if you're looking to acquire focus instantly. Now, the two Sigma lenses perform similarly in this regard, whether on the Sony or the Nikon, in the sense that they just seem to jump to focus. But as I pointed out in the previous video, the Nikon does seem to transition much more seamlessly, and now I know that that's caused by the camera and not the lens, because now I'm using the same lens on both cameras. I can see distinct jumps in focus when using the Sigma on the Sony, but not so much on the Nikon. Now, there are lenses that handle this better for the Sony, but the whole point of this was to compare apples to apples, and even though the Sony is more responsive than the Nikon transitions smoother, and that's a nice feature to have for video. The Sigma 35 for Nikon, though, was the noisiest of the bunch, and probably too noisy for video if you plan to use the built-in mic. The Sigma on the Sony was actually the quietest of the three, and when it comes to the native Nikon 35mm, the only drawback I can really see to that lens when compared to the Sigma Art lens for video is the fact that the Art lens has a mechanical focusing ring where you're going to have to use the electronic focus by wire system for the native Nikon lens, and that's going to be terrible for manual focusing. Also, another thing that I don't really like about the Nikon for video focusing, which speaks to the touch control comment from earlier, is that when you tap on the screen to change the focus point on the Nikon, it doesn't initiate a smooth focus pull, it just jumps to it, almost as if you'd move the focus point and then press the AF on button. And that may be okay for photography, but it's not great for video. And the focus positioning also seems to be a lot more restrictive on the Nikon. I feel like I can't quite get the focus point exactly where I want it, whether I use the joystick or the touchscreen. Now on the Sony, I have the same problem with the joystick, but with the touchscreen, I feel like I have a lot more flexibility in positioning it wherever I want. And so I feel like with the Nikon, it's like I only have like 50 or 60 positions, and I find that kind of limiting. So although I like the screen better on the Nikon, I actually like the functionality of the screen on the Sony a little bit better when it comes to touch focusing. So it's hard to declare a winner for this round because both have pros and cons. I would say when it comes to smoothness and potentially the pleasing look of video, I'd probably give it to the Nikon, but when it comes to the functionality, I would probably give it to the Sony. Now finally, here's the same photo taken on all three lenses with the same exact settings and conditions. Something I noticed right away about the Nikon 35mm, which is in the center of the three images, is that it's actually wider than the two Sigma Art lenses. This makes me feel that this lens isn't actually a 35mm lens, but is a little bit closer to 30mm, and you actually get similar distortion to what you'd expect to see on a wider lens as well, and I personally don't really like that as much because I like the look of the 35mm, so in this case I would say I prefer adapting the 35 than using the native 35, but that again is completely subjective. If you prefer a lens a little bit wider, you might actually prefer the native Nikon in this case. You can see that the two Nikon images look very similar, with the native Nikon lens maybe being a tad brighter. All these images were shot at f2 and used the camera's standard coloration. One thing that some of the comments on the previous video also reflected is that the Nikon had better color science than the Sony, and if you know anything about my previous video on color science, you know that that expression means absolutely nothing to me, and it shouldn't really mean anything to you either. It's a completely subjective analysis, and what it actually comes down to is which camera you like the look of better. And I'm not going to spend any time reviewing that in this video because I find it frivolous to review color science. But if that's your reason for choosing one camera over the other, that's completely valid, but it's not objectively why one camera is better than the other. Anyway, back to the image comparison. Let's zoom in to the center of the frame and compare the sharpness. This is a 900% scale of the center logo, and again, I find the two Nikon lenses to be very similar. But in my opinion, the Sony is a tad sharper, but it's quite minor, and I really had to zoom in to even show it. So that's it for the tests, and I think they've shown once again just how close these two cameras are, and I think you'll do really well with either of them. I hope this kind of served a little bit as a mini review of the Nikon 35mm lens, because now we can see how it compares to the Sigma Art lens, and we can also see how the Sigma Art lens works with the FTZ adapter. So I hope that kind of serves as a multi-review over there. But question for you, something that I really want to know is what features are most important to you when you look at comparing cameras or when you look to make a camera purchase decision? Which factors rank on the top of your list? Let me know in the comments below. For me, I like the Sony better because of its AFC performance and its slightly sharper image, but I also appreciate the better battery life, the more flexible autofocus points, and the USB power supply. But as I shared from the comments on the previous video, there's definitely reasons to prefer the Nikon as well. Lens prices, weather sealing, the bigger body, grip, and buttons, the improved EVF, and smoother autofocus in certain configurations. But ultimately, get the one that you're going to enjoy using the most, because a camera in your hand is worth a whole lot more than one on the shelf. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video helpful or at least entertaining, and if you did, make sure you leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, feel free to hit the dislike button twice. Alright! I'm done.